We're now joined by Professor Noam Chomsky. He's Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT and the author of many books on politics and U.S. foreign policy, including Fateful Triangle, Deterring Democracy, Hegemony or Survival, and the collection 9/11. He also has a piece forthcoming in Jacobin's sister publication, Catalyst, titled An Era of Impunity is Over. Professor Chomsky, welcome to the Jacobin Show.
Thanks to be with you again.
So, Professor, we're approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which of course means that there are now adults in the US who were not yet born when 9/11 happened. And I think when you add to that the fact that Obama ended the war on terror, at least on paper, and then of course last week Biden officially withdrew all troops from Afghanistan and officially ended the war, I suppose the question is, do you think we've arrived at the end of an era? Or perhaps more specifically, do you think that we're witnessing the end of American empire, or at least some kind of new stage?
I think it'll have practically no effect on U.S. imperial policy. If you look at the massive commentary on, of course, which is pouring out, it's almost entirely about what was the cost to us. Okay, find virtually nothing about what was the cost to Afghans. There are a few interesting articles which are appearing showing that what the press understood very well 20 years ago was, but were ridiculing, was in fact correct. Namely, that there was no reasonable basis for the war in the first place, that Osama bin Laden, they aren't saying it, he was a suspect when they started bombing. Well, if there's a suspect who you want to apprehend, you carry out a small police operation, probably with the cooperation of the Taliban, who were eager to get rid of him, but couldn't just throw him out for simple reasons of tribal policy. But they would have probably cooperated. They could have apprehended him, then worked to try to find out if he was actually responsible, which they didn't know. In fact, that was conceded many months later. I think it was 8 months later that Robert Mueller, head of the FBI, gave his first extensive press conference in which he said, this is after probably the most intensive investigation in the world, international investigation, said that we assumed that Al-Qaeda and bin Laden were responsible for 2011, but we haven't been able to establish it yet. That was 8 months later. So first you bomb, and then you look and see if there's any reason. We now know it's now being conceded that the Taliban had in fact surrendered, meaning that they, of course, bin Laden would have been handed over. But Rumsfeld proudly announced, we do not negotiate surrenders. We're going to smash you to pieces. They asked that their terms were that the leading figures in the Taliban be allowed to live with dignity. Why not? They hadn't done anything. The story was they had harbored a terrorist. We don't do that. I mean, we harbor some of the worst war criminals in modern times, including people who are recognized to be terrorists, like Orlando Bosch, Carrillo Posada, Cuban terrorists who were living happily in Florida under U.S. protection. There's no question. Nobody doubted they were They were responsible for, among other things, the bombing of a Cuban airliner in which 70 or 80 people were killed. It's called terrorism if someone else does it. If we do it, it's fun and games. So There was no reason not to allow them to live in dignity, except for what was explained right away in October by the most prominent figure of the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance, Abdul Haq. He was interviewed by a highly regarded Middle East, Central Asia specialist, Anatol Yevin, in the British press. He was asked, his response to the invasion was he bitterly condemned it, as did other Afghan anti-Taliban activists. He said, the Americans just want to show their muscle and scare everyone. They'll kill a lot of Afghans. They'll undermine our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within. He outlined ways that they could do that, which is indeed what happened. He was soon killed by the Taliban. But he said the Americans don't care. They just want to, as he said, show their muscle. Well, that's pretty much Rumsfeld's position at the time. We're not going to negotiate surrender. We're going to show we can attack and destroy defenseless people. That's what we're good at. Now it's being conceded in the press. They knew it at the time. I was writing about it at the time. You didn't have to be a genius. Okay. Anybody who was pointing it out, either they ignored or ridiculed. Now they're conceding that it was correct. Okay. Is that the end of the empire? No, it's just saying, look, we did something that was too costly to us, so now we'll do things better.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that because you've mentioned in other interviews that a lot of the framework that people use to understand withdrawal from Afghanistan is comparing the cost of the war to potential domestic spending for social welfare programs or other things that could benefit Americans. You've obviously pointed out that this is a moral issue, that we owe Afghanistans after decades of destroying their infrastructure, decades of murder, decades of terror. What's a better framework to talk about ending U.S. military campaigns? And as a follow-up, what do we owe Afghanis as we withdraw? And what can the left do to put pressure on the U.S. government to make sure that we are in some way repairing the vast amounts of destruction that have happened there?
Well, there are some concrete things. You're right about the framework. That's the way it's discussed. And it's true that the crazy war spending in general, $780 billion war Pentagon budget, is first of all endangering us very much. And it's also taking away resources that are badly needed for other purposes. That's quite apart from Afghanistan. So that point is correct, but that's not the framework for looking at what happens when we attack and destroy other countries. Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen right now, a whole long list. Yes, we're responsible for doing something to try to help them escape from the wreckage for which we are substantially responsible. There are concrete things. One is we should be admitting Afghan refugees, no bureaucratic hassles, no putting them off in some other place. They should be treated decently. And incidentally, that's not the whole story. There are plenty of people right now, not very far from where I live in Tucson, who are still escaping the ravages of the Reagan's brutal terrorist wars in Central America. They're fleeing from the wreckage. What do? We block them. We bribe Mexico to keep them from ever reaching our borders. When they get here, we stick them in what amounts to concentration camps. We don't have to go through the details, you know it better than I do. Well, okay, not hardly the way to deal with the crimes that we've committed. Most of the returned for a while, maybe still, the plurality of the refugees were coming from Honduras. That's a reflection of President Obama and Hillary Clinton's recognition of the military junta, which overthrew a mildly reformist government. The U.S. was practically alone in that. The coup was denounced all over. Clinton and Obama wouldn't call it a coup because that meant they'd have to stop funding the military that was throwing out the government and turning Honduras into one of the murder capitals of the world. And ran a fake election, which everyone denounced. Obama, Clinton praised it as an important step to democracy. People are fleeing. So what do? Well, take a look at the border. That's what we do. So yes, it's much more than Afghans. Second thing we should do is put an end to this disgraceful program of putting sanctions on Afghanistan. I don't like the Taliban. You don't like them, but that's no reason for punishing Afghans. They need the humanitarian aid badly. It's Afghan people who are starving, not the Taliban leaders. Sanctions in general, very generally, punish the population, not the leadership. That was true of the sanctions on Iraq, sanctions on Iran, on Cuba, on Venezuela. It's just a way of punishing the people. We actually know the reasons. They're sometimes even announced. So in the case of Cuba, which is one of the worst atrocities of the modern world, the US began back in 1960 to punish Cubans, not the leadership, for the reason that was explicitly stated by State Department representatives. They recognized that then Castro was very popular, and the only way to overthrow the government was to foment discontent among the population, make life so impossible that people would overthrow the government. Of course, it wasn't the only way. Kennedy also launched a major terrorist war, which practically brought the world to nuclear disaster in 1962. Speak of harboring terrorists. But the sanctions then aren't designed. They were intensified by Clinton when Cuba was in a desperate position after the Russians pulled out. Clinton outflanked Bush from the right to increase the sanctions so as to starve the population and beat them into submission so they'll overthrow the government. That's exactly what's going on now. Okay. So incidentally, the United States is the only country in the world that can impose sanctions. And the sanctions are third-party sanctions. Everyone has to obey them, or else they get tossed out of the international financial system. The US is alone in the world in the capacity to do that. Major form of state terrorism. Case of Afghanistan coming along as another one. We should unblock the IMF and World Bank funding. They're blocking funding, of course, under US pressure. That should be stopped. We should make every possibility for the Taliban to somehow, and the population to somehow solve their own problems in whatever way they can, not a good way. There would have been better ways, I think, starting back in the late 1980s. For example, it's touching to see the concern for women's rights now. Everybody's concerned with women's rights. How wonderful and touching. What happened in the late 1980s when the Russians had a regime in place, the Jacobin regime, which was protecting women's rights. The women were going to university, wearing whatever clothes they want. They did have problems. The problems were the US-backed Islamic maniacs like Jacobin Hekmatyar, who were throwing acid in the faces of women with the wrong clothes. Well, that was the late 80s. Actually, that was written about by very credible people. Russell Basu, leading international feminist woman who organized the International Year of Women in 1974. She was the UN rapporteur for women's rights in Afghanistan. She wrote articles about this, sent them to US journals, wouldn't publish them. Even Ms. Magazine wouldn't publish them. Wrong story, you know. We're not supporting women's rights now. Because it was a Russian-run regime. Now, we're concerned with women's rights. Yes, very moving.
I want to follow up on that because, as you were just alluding to, I think when Biden announced the withdrawal of troops, there was suddenly this wave of media commentary, talking, as you said, about women and girls and what kind of fate they might face under the Taliban, talking about how there was almost certainly going to be a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan following the withdrawal. And as you pointed out, I think that if there's anything the last 20 or more years have taught us, it's that we should be critical or suspicious, at least, of this idea of so-called humanitarian intervention. And I've also noticed a lot of progressives even saying, or invoking the Pottery Barn rule, which is you break it, you buy it, right? And I think the idea is that they don't feel that it's right for the US to create this disaster in Afghanistan and then just pack up and leave. In light of all of this commentary, I'm wondering if there are other humanitarian projects that you think progressives should be supporting that, aside from, ending sanctions and admitting more refugees, that don't fall into this trap of continuing the intervention?
Well, first of all, I should say that I'm sure there are people on the ground in Afghanistan who really are committed to human rights, to rights of women, rights of others, but they're not the policymakers.
Mm-hmm.
That's always true. There are plenty of good people who are working on the ground, just as there were under the Russian intervention. Good people working on the ground, concerned with women's rights, concerned with human rights, didn't justify the invasion, but that was happening. But we're talking about policy, not
Mm-hmm.
people who are trying to do something. The first step in humanitarian intervention is to stop destroying. If we can stop destroying, terrorizing, using our muscle to intimidate everyone, whatever the consequences, that'll be a big step forward. And then if we can get that far, you can start thinking what we can do that might be of some value. And there are things. So take George W. Bush, who was responsible for the invasion of Afghanistan and invasion of Iraq that followed later, millions of people killed, countries destroyed, the whole region wrecked through ethnic conflict that didn't exist before. But he did some good things. His health programs in Africa, for example, were quite helpful. And okay, fine, that's humanitarian intervention. Support some health programs in Africa. We could carry out a humanitarian program right now by making vaccines available to Latin America, Caribbean, Africa, Asia. Actually, the US is doing a little better than Europe is on this. Europe is even worse than us in many respects. Biden has at least taken some small steps, but not the major steps, the steps called for by the people's vaccine movement, freeing up the exorbitant intellectual property rights, patent rights that not only patent the product, but also the process, something new introduced by Clinton and other neoliberal fanatics in the World Trade Organization rules, radical violation of free trade, never existed in the past, ridiculous rights that support huge profits for drug monopolies. Oh, well, we can eliminate that. Allow other countries to manufacture the vaccines, which were mostly created on public funding anyway. Let other countries investigate them. Their own engineers can probably figure out better processes than the drug companies have, make them available to the countries that need them. You could do that. As I say, Europe's even worse than we are, but that's no justification. But that would be humanitarian intervention. Eliminating, take, say, Cuba, one of the worst atrocities of the modern age. The whole world, literally, is opposed strongly to what we're doing. Last vote at the UN was 184-2. Israel has to go along with the US because it's client state. They do what we say. Nobody else would. Does it make any difference? Does it even get reported? I mean, just tighten the grips, to punish them for standing up to us, for what the State Department back in the 60s called successful defiance of US policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s. We're not going to let anybody get away with that. No, make up all sorts of stories about human rights, if you like. There are human rights abuses in Cuba. In fact, some of the worst in the hemisphere. They're taking place in the southeast corner of Cuba, a place called Guantanamo, which the US took at gunpoint, refuses to give back. Probably the worst human rights, certainly way beyond any human rights in Cuba, maybe in the hemisphere. Okay, so yes, let's stop violating human rights viciously in places we've stolen from Cuba at gunpoint and maintain, because it holds a major port and it prevents Cuban development and therefore harms the Cuban people. So maybe they'll overthrow their government. Okay, we can stop all of that. That'd be humanitarian intervention. You can look around the world and find endless things like that. Actual humanitarian intervention, it barely exists. There's a lot of scholarship on this, incidentally, and I've reviewed a lot of it. It's very hard to find an authentic case of humanitarian intervention. Of course, every great power action is called humanitarian. That's universal. When Hitler invaded Poland, it was to protect people from the wild terror of the Poles. In fact, if we had records from Attila the Hun, it would probably be humanitarian. Okay, but we can put that aside. Look at the actual cases. Really hard to find an authentic one in the entire historical record. States are not moral agents. It's more, they act for the interests of their own dominant classes, overwhelmingly. You can find a few exceptions here and there, like Bush's health program in Africa. But you really have to look hard.
Yeah, the case that you were making about humanitarian intervention by freeing the patents and allowing foreign governments to make the vaccine is particularly interesting in light of the fact that the US was running a fake vaccination program in Pakistan to try to get information about Osama bin Laden, and it undermined real humanitarian efforts to give people medical care. And so you see that there are a few wings of US imperialism. One is financial, one is military might, and the other is medical care. And it's coming to a head during the pandemic in a horrifying way, because you have a government that has systematically undermined the trust of its medical facilities and medical interventions domestically and abroad. And now is the moment when the United States could be poised to actually do good on a mass scale with the vast amounts of wealth and privilege and resources this country has. And even if it were to do that, it's hard to think that these other countries could trust those efforts after years and years and years of this kind of brutal bait and switch campaigning and trickery. And I wanted to talk about the ways in which the US media rehabilitates this image. So one particular example, I think key example from this time, is George Bush, who was rehabilitated in the eyes of the liberal establishment. He started out as evil incarnate, rushing us into a war we had no business starting, into two wars we had no business starting. Then he was turned into a kind of bumbling oaf that ran interference for like Dick Cheney, who was the mastermind behind the scenes. And now he's become a sort of lovable, folksy painter, friend of Michelle Obama. We've seen the media talking about how Biden botched the withdrawal, and they're saying that he can't recover from this, and maybe this will be a turning point in public opinion. It could crush the Democrats' chances in later elections. But Bush has escaped, it seems, any kind of blame for his role as a war criminal. Can you talk about the way that the media sort of whitewashes its own recent history, and also why? Why does it do that?
Take Henry Kissinger, honored, one of the worst war criminals in modern history. It's hard to even take, say, Cambodia, 1970. Kissinger loyally followed his master, Richard Nixon, and transmitted orders of a kind that I don't think ever have appeared in the historical record. Orders to the American Air Force, said massive bombing campaign in Cambodia, anything that flies against anything that moves. See if you can find an analog to that in the historical record among the Nazis, among anyone. Well, and it wasn't just words. It led to a horrendous bombing campaign, horrific bombing campaign, which turned the Khmer Rouge at the time had been a small guerrilla group, a couple thousand people. By the end of the bombing campaign, which devastated rural Cambodia, there were hundreds of thousands of enraged peasants. Well, then came ugly actions, which we can blame on them. Okay, but that's one Henry Kissinger. Go to India. Henry Kissinger supported the Pakistani destruction of East Bengal. Huge number of people killed, maybe a million or more. He threatened India with punishment if India dared to try to put an end to the huge slaughter. What were the reasons? He didn't want to he had a planned photo op where he was going to secretly go to China and meet, the Mao and shake hands, and would be détente, would be very exciting. And he had to go through Pakistan to get there. And all of this slaughter was undermining his photo op. Okay, so let's kill a million Bengalis. What about Chile? Kissinger was the point man, pressing hard for the overthrow of the Allende government. 2 tracks. One track was just straight and violence, military coup. Then there was a soft track, make the economy scream, make it impossible for people to live. Okay, well, they finally got what they wanted, instituted a vicious dictatorship, which incidentally was the first 9/11. What happened in 2001 was the second 9/11. The first one was much worse by any measure. We translate it to per capita terms, which is the right way. It would be as if on what we call 9/11, 30,000 people had been killed outright. 500,000 had been tortured. The government was overthrown. A vicious dictatorship instituted. Terror, torture, horrors, celebrated not only by the United States, celebrated it, poured funds in to help the new dictatorship. International agencies did the same. They'd been withholding funds from Allende, poured them in. The neoliberals, people who've been running the world for the last 40 years, loved it. They moved in to advise the government. Friedrich Hayek, the moral leader of neoliberalism, visited and said he was impressed by the freedom under Pinochet. Said he couldn't find a single person in Chile who didn't think there was more freedom under Pinochet dictatorship than under Allende. Somehow he couldn't hear the cries of anguish from the torture chambers in the Via Grimaldi and others. Well, that's the reaction to the first 9/11. I'm sure there are jihadis who celebrated the second 9/11. We think they're terrible. We're much worse. Take a look at ourselves. Is anybody going to talk about that on the anniversary of 9/11? Maybe you will. I will. A handful of other people will be denounced, of course. But it's true. That was the first 9/11, much worse than what happened in September 2001. Okay, goes on. So if you want to know what we can do, we can begin by educating ourselves, by rising to some minimal moral level so we can pay attention to what we do and what we have done. Just take this notion of forever wars that's being bandied about. Biden ended the forever wars. When did the forever wars start? Well, 1783. 1783, the British pulled out. That freed the colonists from the yoke that the British had imposed. They had prevented the colonists from invading what was called Indian country, the Indian nations, to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. British had blocked that. Colonists weren't accepting that. Certainly not people like George Washington, major land speculator, wanted to go out and exterminate the Indians who he said will disappear. They are like wolves. They will disappear like the wolves, George Washington. Immediately, the colonists launched murderous, brutal wars against the Indian nations, extermination, dispersal, treaties broken. Every horror you can think of. They knew what they were doing. The leading figure, the intellectual architect of Manifest Destiny, John Quincy Adams, in his later years, he lamented what he called the fate of that hapless race of Native Americans who we are exterminating with such malicious atrocities. That was long after his own contributions, major contributions to the process. And that was before the worst of it. Then it went on to California, where it was truly genocidal. Well, we finally, there's a famous diplomatic history. You can buy a copy of it, a well-known diplomatic history of the United States by Thomas Bailey, who discusses this. He says it was defensive. He said after the colonists got their freedom, they turned to the task of, I'm quoting, felling trees and Indians and expanding to their natural borders. Meanwhile, picking up half of Mexico in the process, robbing Hawaii from its natives. That's forever wars. The United States has been at war practically every year since it was founded. Well, there were some victims. What about asking them about the costs? They have voices. Most of them were exterminated, but there's some who are left, and they left records. So we can ask about the forever wars. Nobody's going to ask that, I don't think. It's the forever wars that cost us too much. So there's a good article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, one of the lead articles, main establishment journal. It's called something like The Cost of the Afghan War to the United States. Yes, it's a very serious cost, trillions of dollars to the United States. What about the people who we've been exterminating and attacking and destroying for 250 years, ever since the country was founded? Goes on. There's an article in the New York Times today by a nice person, Samuel Moyn, good, decent guy, about how the United States is turning to more humanitarian wars. Says they're still terrible, but they're more humanitarian than before. And he gives an example. George the first Bush, the statesman Bush, his first invasion of Kuwait and Iraq, he says, much more humanitarian than earlier wars. Was it? I mean, American army sank to the level as the Iraqi army, of course, was totally overwhelmed by US force as they were retreating from Kuwait. The peasant conscripts, poor conscripts, Shiite Kurdish conscripts who were conscripted by Saddam to fight the war, were trying to flee. But the American army was using bulldozers to shovel them into ditches to suffocate them so they couldn't flee. And then, well, George Bush was orating about how what we say goes. His Air Force was destroying completely undefended infrastructure throughout Iraq. Okay, this was incidentally a war also which never had to be fought. There were plenty of options for diplomatic settlement. Press refused to report them. The US government just dismissed them. I could tell you more details about this if there were time, but could have been a war that was avoided. In fact, though this will outrage millions of people, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was not all that different from the US invasion of Panama a couple of months earlier. Could go into the details. I wrote about it at the time. I won't review it. Gone from history. Nothing, How about bringing it back to history? Not the way the New York Times is now running articles about what they knew 20 years ago. At the time, they knew that, for example, that the leading figures in the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance were denouncing the invasion because the US wants to show its muscle and scare everyone and doesn't care about the Afghans. They knew it. Did you see it at the time? No. People who mentioned it were simply ridiculed and denounced. Unpatriotic, not good red-blooded Americans who line up to crush everyone by force because that's our métier. Nothing changed. Going back to the first question, nothing's changed. Same institutions, same doctrines, same beliefs. Of course, the world is somewhat different. One difference is the population. There's something that Samuel Moyn didn't understand, probably doesn't understand, and didn't mention in his column this morning. He said there is actually an effect of more humanitarian wars. It's not coming from the professors and the academics who he referred to, who somehow are writing articles saying we should be more humane. It's not coming from them. It's coming from people like you. It's coming from people on the ground. The country has become more civilized as a result of the activism of the 60s, the aftermath. Plenty of evidence from that. Doesn't get discussed. It's not the right story. So, for example, take the Central American wars. There was horrible atrocities, hundreds of thousands of people killed, torture, massacre, everything you can think of. But there were things the US couldn't do. It could not do what John F. Kennedy could do in South Vietnam 20 years earlier. They tried, but they couldn't do it. Too much opposition here. Reagan, in fact, when he came into office, tried to duplicate what Kennedy had done in 20 years earlier. It was an immediate backlash from the population. We're not accepting that anymore. In fact, what happened in Central America was something totally new in the entire history of imperialism. Can't get reported, but it was very significant. It's the first time ever that people in the aggressor country didn't just protest, but went to live with the victims. Went to live with the victims, to try to help them, try to give whatever assistance a white face might give, and help them in projects. People from Middle America, evangelical churches, all sorts of, I visited churches in rural America where they knew more about Central America than the academics because they were working there. And it's never happened. Nobody in France went to live in an Algerian village. Nobody in the United States went to live in a Vietnamese village. I mean, unheard of. Well, that happened in Central America. And that's the kind of thing that has changed what the US government can do, not articles by academics in professional journals, but what's been happening in activism on the ground. And that can make a difference now too. That's what changes the world.
So that actually leads really well into a question I wanted to ask you, which is that, of course, you've been active in anti-war movements since the Vietnam War. And when I think back on the anti-war movement that sprang up after Afghanistan, and particularly in the lead up to the Iraq War, I should admit I myself was a young, if not entirely effective or strategic protester during that time period. And looking back on it, if we look at the anti-war movement at that time and ask, did it stop the war or even slow the war or the two wars? The answer, of course, is no. But I'm wondering if if you think that there's something we can take away from the anti-war movement of that time period, or what you think future anti-war movements can learn from the time period leading up to Afghanistan and Iraq.
First thing they should learn is how effective they were. The common view is we failed. It's not true. You look at the plans, they weren't carried out. We've just learned a couple of days ago from high-level German sources that the Bush administration was apparently planning the use of nuclear weapons in Afghanistan. They couldn't do that. US population wouldn't tolerate it. The Iraq War also had something new in the history of imperialism. There were massive protests, which you participated in, before the war was officially launched. In fact, the war had been going on for a long time. Back to Clinton, had been bombing Iraq, but the war was officially launched in March 2003. The day before, I I remember my own classes at MIT. The students in the class demanded that the class be canceled so that we could all participate in the mass demonstrations before the war was officially declared. It's never happened in the history of imperialism. That was all over the place. Well, what happened in Iraq was bad enough. Could have been a lot worse. If the government was, if Rumsfeld, Cheney, the rest of them were unleashed, we don't know what would have happened. But they were constrained by public opposition on the ground. That's happened over and over. We haven't, doesn't get written about. It's the wrong story, but it's the story we should recognize. So I don't think the anti-war movement was ineffective. I think it was very effective. It's what, to go back to Samuel Moyn this morning, it's the real factor that led to the very limited reduction in violence and terror and destruction that we see. And the lesson is continue it harder. Take the threat of nuclear weapons. It's a very serious threat, mounted significantly under Trump. Biden, so far at least, is pursuing the same policies. Well, let's look back. Early 1980s, there were huge public demonstrations, probably the biggest in American history, condemning the emplacement of short distance missiles in Western Germany, reach Moscow with a 10-minute flight time, greatly increasing the threat of war, Pershing missiles. Similar protests in Europe, enormous protests. Well, that had an effect. It led Reagan to accept Gorbachev's offers for a reduction for elimination of for establishing the INF Treaty, intermediate range missiles. That was an enormous step towards peace. It reduced significantly threats that could have easily led to nuclear war. Well, Trump dismantled the treaty, part of his general wrecking ball, destroying everything that has anything of value, destroyed the INF Treaty, most of the rest of the arms control regime. And immediately, this was, I think, August 2019, picked the anniversary of Hiroshima Day to announce it, eliminate the INF Treaty, and immediately launch missiles which violate the treaty, saying to the Russians, come on, boys, join us. We can have fun and create new, more destructive missiles which will destroy everything. It'll really be fun, you know. It's the demonstrations of the early 80s that put some kind of limit on this. That's lessons too. They can take place now. Stop the race to disaster that's going on there. Same with climate destruction. Pressure from the population, young people mostly, has pressured Biden to put on paper programs that are not too bad, not enough, but much better than anything that appeared before on paper. Okay. Now take a look at what happens. Last week, the IPCC released its latest report. Very grim report, much worse than anything before. Didn't get anywhere near adequate coverage here, but it was very serious. That was on Monday. And what happened on Tuesday? On Tuesday, Biden issued an appeal to OPEC, the oil cartel, to increase production of oil because he wants gas prices to decline in the United States to improve his electoral prospects. So that's what happened on Monday and Tuesday. So nice things on paper, but there are things that happen in the world. Well, that's why activism on the ground makes a difference. Sunrise Movement activists took over Nancy Pelosi's office, got support from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, so they didn't just get thrown out. That led to an actual resolution in Congress. It's on the floor. Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey of Massachusetts have a resolution which has a very sensible program which would deal effectively with the severe threat of global destruction through environmental destruction. It's a resolution, but you have to get beyond a resolution to a legislation. That's going to take a lot of work. Republicans, of course, will be 100% opposed. Their commitment at this point is slavishly serve the corporate sector and shine Trump's boots so that the crowds he's organized don't go after you. That's the Republican Party. Doesn't matter what happens to the country or the world. 100%, no deviation. Then there's a couple of Democrats who can block anything. We know it. We know who they are. Well, that means work.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you said about the shift in strategy initially because of the pressure of the anti-war movement. I grew up in a town where there were signs, spray painted signs that said nuke the towel heads after 9/11. Really brutal desire for violence. And I remember a shift happening in the rhetoric that went from kind of like blatant bloodlust to we're being smarter with how we fight the war. And that was a way to kind of introduce drones as a humanitarian weapon. But it was also a response to pressure from the anti-war movement that said, we're not going to sit back and watch civilian casualties in silence. We're not going to triumphantly march blindly into another war. And so I think that there's a way in which the victories of the left get swallowed up and rehashed as an idea that came from the center or came from the right. Like, no, we are being humanitarian. We're doing targeted drone strikes now. And that's better for US citizens who get to play video games that actually kill people. And it's better for Afghanis who, better not go to the wrong wedding venue, essentially. So I think that it's imperative that we take a real inventory of our failures and of our victories and not allow them to get reworked by the dominant media narrative. And as we go into another 2 decades of intense change, I think we've obviously seen the flooding across the eastern part of the United States and the southeast with Hurricane Ida, the casualties from that. It's bringing the truth of climate change home. We're seeing a proliferation in nuclear weapons in the United States that, like you said, has been vastly underreported. It's staggering. They're faster, swifter, smaller. I wanted to talk to you about the ways in which we can talk about left foreign policy. What is left foreign policy? How do we advocate for left foreign policy? How do we keep clear-headed when we're being plied with rosy promises from bad actors?
Well, you publish articles in Jacobin and you organize people to act on what they learn. There's no secrets. We know how to do it. The thing is to do it. It's been done over and over. Every popular move, every major cause that's been won over the centuries has been won by people who are working on the ground. Take, say, the civil rights movement. Mention the civil rights movement. The name that comes to mind is Martin Luther King, who was a great figure. He deserves it. But I'm sure he would have been the first to say that he was riding on a wave that was created by people whose names nobody knows. SNCC activists who were riding freedom buses through Alabama, facing threats, killing, and so on, trying to encourage a black farmer to have the courage to dare to go to a voting booth in a bitterly racist country. Okay, well, those are the people who, my old friend Howard Zinn put it pretty well once. He said that what matters is the countless number of unknown people who lay the basis for the changes that take place in history. He said it more eloquently, but basically that. I think that's the point. We don't even know the names of the people who've done the really significant and important work, just as we don't know the names of the people overseas who are struggling for their rights courageously under horrible conditions. Okay, we can help them in many ways. It's been done in the past, can be done more in the future. Now, we don't have a lot of time now. The problems are much more urgent than they were in the past. The climate problem, a couple of decades. We don't take care of it in a couple of decades, we'll pass tipping points. Face the fact that the Republicans are probably going to get back into power, probably next year, maybe more in 2024. That means pure denialism, 100% denialism. Let's race over the precipice as quickly as possible, because it'll put a little more money in the pockets of our corporate masters. That's the Republican Party. It's going to be a big fight to try to do something about that. Not that Democrats are so magnificent. I talked about Biden, but at least they can be pressed. Okay. Actually, younger Republicans can too. It's not among younger Republicans, there's less of the cowardly, brutal dedication to massive destruction in the interests of private wealth. That's the older part of the Republican leadership, the Lindsey Grahams. But younger people are somewhat different, and they can be reached. Okay, that can make a difference.
Well, that's the goal. Thank you. You've played a massive part in that. And we really owe you a huge debt of gratitude for everything and for all of the unknown names and opinions that you've brought into the public eye, as well as your own.
Thank you very much.
I just want to quickly mention, for my part, when I was a teen anti-war protester, I was living, much like Ariella, in a very conservative state. And somehow a friend and I managed to get a copy of two books. One was Howard Zinn's Terrorism and War, and the other was, of course, your collection of interviews, 9/11. So I did not think that I would get a chance to thank you in person or just over Zoom, but thanks very much. Those two books were really foundational, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, they were honored with being contraband where I went to high school.
Right, exactly.
I don't think I was allowed to take them in, which tells you a lot.
One of my achievements has been to have my books banned from Guantanamo.
Yeah.
Good to talk to you.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.